Bienvenidos a nuestro quinto episodio de nuestro podcast Guáchame Testimonios of Resiliencia. My name is Rosario Dominguez.
Y yo soy Nancy Dominguez Frat. In today's episode, we have Dr. Ricardo Camacho. He's going to share his testimonial on becoming a bilingual school psychologist. We are so excited to have you here and to have our audience learn more about your story. Thank you.
So I'm going to share a little bio of Dr. Ricardo Camacho. He is a licensed bilingual psychologist serving in a predominantly Latino, Latina, Latinx school setting. He recently earned his doctorate of education in schools of psychology from Loyola University in Chicago, actually May of 2021. He is from Chicago, Illinois, the son of two Mexican immigrants, a first-generation graduate student specializing in mental health and education, and an advocate for mental health supports in schools.
And congratulations on becoming a doctor.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And thank you for having me here today, because I think, just being able to share with you and, having witnessed your podcast and the guests you've had already, I think it's a really great thing. So I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. We're excited.
He's actually the first male, too.
Yes,
so.
We're so excited. Yes.
We've only had women, but...
Yeah.
But it's going to be really interesting. So I guess we can start. If you can just tell us what led you to become a school psychologist, first of all.
Yes, of course. And I think, beginning with that is that sometimes, we won't even know that the position of school psychologist existed, right? Because sometimes when we think of a psychologist, we mainly think, there mainly would be at a hospital, clinic, or any other place rather than a school. And thankfully for me, I was exposed to this profession because I would go with my mom to school meetings all the time. And, sometimes, a school psychologist would be there, and specifically, talking about how to support, my family, myself. And at that time I was like, I was so curious, right? I was like, oh, cool. Like, what does this person do? And meetings and stuff like that. So that's how I got exposed to the field, first of all. And I think, just through my upbringing and just seeing how the progression of how, growing up through, with a single parent mother, and then also just acknowledging the many, difficulties we had at the time. And also just going to school, right? Because, as a young, kid, at the time, I was going to school every day. And that was my main job. And I think at the time, not many people within my schools really understood what it was from my own unique experience. So whether that was, moving from school to school every year, whether that was, thinking about something that was going on at home while trying to learn math and science, right? So there was a lot of things that through my upbringing that I knew I struggled with. And I also, as I grew up to go college and further my education, I was like, I think I could possibly see myself in this position, helping students like myself, but ultimately all students in schools, because we know that, every student in our schools is going to have some type of difficulty at some point of their school career, right? And I wanted to be, a part of that, focus and helping our students, empowering our students to let them know that, they're capable, and just letting them know hey, you got this, and how can we help you get there? So that's how I was kind of pushed into that, role. And then also just acknowledging, that many, being a Latino male, I think there's various things that comes with, mental health. And that's where I started being more curious. I was like, okay, how do I kind of combine the two? So I think school psychology became the perfect field to me to engage in, not only, helping students in schools with education, and then also, kind of diving a little bit deeper into what it means to be Latino, and when it comes to mental health, especially.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And I know you're in a high school. You work in a high school context. What does your job consist of? What is your day-to-day basis? I'm assuming you're doing multiple things. And sort of, what are your favorite parts of your job working with youth?
So I think in a nutshell, a school psychologist, we have expertise in mental health and education. So we're uniquely qualified to support and address the needs of students in schools. So what does that mean, right? So in helping students learn, there comes with many things to that. So not only, the science behind learning in general, but also, how does, behavior play a part into that? How does mental health play a part into that? how does even school climate play a part as well, right? So how do we compare a student who might be in a very, prestigious or just, fully funded school compared to, another on the other end, right, where their needs are not there, the supports they need to be successful aren't as accessible as they need to. So we work in a lot into that. So when it comes to that, we work with, working with teachers to support them in the classroom. We'll work with, interventions, whether it be individual, connecting with students one-on-one, and then also working with administrators to see like how can we improve the school by highlighting the strengths, by also highlighting what can we do to make this more just overall better experience for students. And I think with my role specifically, I really enjoyed that one-on-one connection, because I think when students see me, and even teachers themselves, when they see me, they start to wonder like, oh, what does he do in the school? Like who is he? And just being able to connect with anyone in my everyday responsibilities, I think that's amazing. And then also just a chance to connect with parents, the community, because sometimes they're like the stakeholder that their voice is often silenced, especially when you're in a Latino community, where I think sometimes we're viewed as the experts, and they have a lot of trust in us to make decisions. But I think their voice is so vital to how we support their children, because they're not our children, they're their children, right? We're there to support them, and I think they know their children the best. And being in a high school, I think especially now, it's a time to recognize, what our students are going through. Because like I said already, many of our students are going to be facing many difficulties that not always visible, right? We have those high excelling students that, are getting straight A's, but at the same time, they might be, battling with something that is not visible, compared to a student that might be involved, for example, with gang life, right? And so there's many profiles, there's many, experiences that a student can have, but I think just being able to support students, and then also just acknowledge that our field is growing so rapidly that it creates a lot of opportunity for, to my position to look differently across schools, right? So that's why I really enjoy doing, what I do. And, as with, of course, with the circumstances as they stand now, it'll be interesting how that position, grows and unfolds as we continue with this school year, and then also next school year as well.
Yeah, and it's very interesting when you mention, going to CPS schools. Like, I don't even think we ever had a school psychologist.
I was thinking
So,
that right now. Like,
yeah.
I'm trying really hard to think, like, if there was one person, and I don't know if that's a legal requirement now, like, to have a school psychologist versus, like, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Like, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But I can't think of, I remember having counselors, right? But that's
Yeah.
completely different. But I can't think of having a school
psychologist.
We might have shared one. I was there, like, once, but I really don't. Like, we didn't know that resource was there.
So, that tells the need, to have more of that in schools, especially CPS schools where they're predominantly Latino, Black. We go through poverty. There's gangs in our neighborhoods as well. There's trauma, and so, yeah. But hearing from you, like, that since you were young, you kind of knew you wanted to be a psychologist, and now that you're not just becoming a psychologist because that's a way of earning income, but you are coming into this field with a purpose. Mm-hmm. So my question would be, what are your goals as a school psychologist as you look into the next year or two and just the future?
I think overall, my main focus, as a professional in this field, and as well as like anyone in education, I just want to contribute to lowering the barriers that are limiting our students at success, right? So what are those barriers look like? And sometimes we might not even be aware of those barriers. So for example, I usually work with culturally, and linguistically diverse students. So for example, they might be only Spanish speaking. They might have just, came to the US recently, and sometimes their experiences is often, misconceived. They're not really aware of, how these students are really, how they are in school, right? So I think that's a goal in mind, especially being a bilingual school psychologist and being, certified to practice, with students who are only Spanish speaking. I want to be an advocate for them. I want to be there, when they're often misunderstood. So, for example, I think this is very common in schools is that, let's say, when a student is, having difficulty in classes, they're not getting the best grades, for example. A common misconception with our students is that and I hate this, is that sometimes they think that they have a learning disability. And sometimes with my role, like, thankfully, I get to, dispel this myth that we have about students struggling, because and it's often, kind of, it's almost like a shock to myself still, because in a simple conversation with a parent or family in Spanish, right, we come to learn of so many things that might be happening. So that can be, not having stable income, just like my experiences, not having stable housing, not being able to, make school a priority, because sometimes, our students have to work, especially when they're at the high school setting. So, it brings about many opportunities to learn about our students. So in being a bilingual school psych, I hope to, collaborate with our educators, and administrators, to let them know, like, hey, sometimes our most vulnerable students are, we might even know who they are, and, they're right in front of us, right? And as we know, with, bilingual students, in our schools, they're increasing every year. And I think that need is going to be even higher. So, so just being in this position, I'm seeing, what the needs are, what the shortages are. And I think that's overall as my goal is just to advocate for them.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. As you were speaking, I was thinking about when I was a teacher in high school, and one of the only Latinas in a Spanish department, right, in a high school, which is very common as well. Slowly changing too, but I remember like teachers saying like, oh, these parents don't care about their kids, like they don't ever like come to the meetings, they don't. And I remember feeling really like angry about that. I'm like, you're talking about my parents, you're talking about my uncles. And I remember telling them, like, how many jobs do you think these parents are working? Also, like, you're emailing them. Have you tried calling them? Like, like figuring, and I'm also like, kind of sharing like Latino families, specifically Mexican families, they trust you guys. They trust the school. Yeah. Esa confianza that you guys are making the decisions that are, the best for their children. So even like talking to parents about like, it's okay to trust, but here in this country, this is how the system works, right? So, because oftentimes parents don't know how the system works because it's different from Mexico, right? Like it's completely different. But I remember hearing that, and like, I'm like, how many kids fail, or how many parents don't have access to this information because they're sending an email that the parent might never check, or like, just having these deficit framings of our students without understanding that some of them have to work third shifts and they're falling asleep in your class because they have to help pay rent at home, So I'm really glad that there's people like you advocating, like, to kind of like, in a way, code switch and talk to teachers about like, this is kind of what's happening in these communities, and you have to understand that you're teaching different students with different needs, different communities, because that's like, as teachers, we have to know these things, right, to service our students as well. So I'm glad that like part of your role is that, to kind of work with teachers. Now that we're in a pandemic, though, all these awesome things that you're doing, like how have they been affected, right? How has your job been affected with the pandemic the last year? Like, how can you still accomplish, or how have you been able to navigate these changes, right, with this new virtual sort of setting?
Of course, and before the pandemic started, there was really a need for mental health supports, and services in schools, right? So how does that look when I think it was March 2020, when we had to make that full transition home. So being a practitioner, at that time, from March until May, we couldn't do any assessments, because obviously we do those in person. So mainly my role mainly transitioned into being, honestly, just crisis prevention and management. So what does that mean is that, for example, if a student's at home, having a crisis, we had to be there. We were literally almost first responders. And what that meant is that, if a student messaged us saying, they weren't doing their best and they needed help, we would connect with someone at home, hopefully, and someone would answer. And we would connect them with, obviously, the most, appropriate supports, whether that be, any recommendations and resources for counseling, for example, or even more immediate need. So that was one big piece of it. And I think also another piece was just being there for students. Sometimes, when we think we tend to overthink like what our students need, and at the time they just needed us there with them. So that meant, just communicating with them online through so for example, we used Microsoft Teams, so something to communicate with them. And then also just being on standby because, we were at home. So how do we know how our students are doing when we can't be in front of them ourselves? So now that, with this school year specifically, my building, we had to go in person. We were given, masks, those plastic dividers to put between ourselves and students or anybody else in the school. So it was really, different for me. I was not used to that. It felt like, it wasn't like, working in a school. It felt like a triage almost. But now, hopefully, with the next school year, we get to transition back. But I know many times people say, let's get back to normalcy. But, was normalcy really, the best at the time? And it comes to, the shortages we have with just speaking about mental health professionals in schools. So now, for example, when it comes to, what it means for our roles, I know that right now, at the time, I was supporting 1,500 students when it's recommended that my position supports only 500 students. And when you look at that nationally, 43 states for school psychologists, they serve over 1,000 students. So it tells you a lot about the need for, not just my profession, school psychology, but also mental health professionals to be present there for our students.
Yeah.
Yeah, and something that we keep hearing is like we're calling you a bilingual psychologist, and that's a very important thing to highlight because like we were talking about advocating for kids in school, and obviously someone that's not from that community, someone that doesn't speak their language or doesn't understand that culture can't really appropriately advocate. They might just complain about them. So I think it's really important that you're in the place you're at now. But I wanted to point out something that we found out, which is troubling and hopefully encourages others to follow the path of psychology, other Latinos. But we found that only 7% of Latinos make up school psychologists. And you are the only one, the only bilingual school psychologist, because Latinos could be bilingual, could be not bilingual, but you're the only bilingual school psychologist in your district. So what do you think, what impact does it have, do you think, in the communities that you serve that are predominantly Latino?
Of course, and when you speak about a school setting and a school district that is predominantly 97% Latino, right? And at the same time, out of the 7 school psychologists that we had within the district, only myself was bilingual, right? So Spanish speaking, certified, through the state. So what does that mean, right? Is that sometimes it's you're gonna lack the things that's needed to serve a community like that. And it resembles education itself, right? So we know that predominantly when you're going to have the staff being anything from 87% and higher, being white, and then when you have like other races and ethnicities, being whether it's black, brown, Asian descent or anything like that, that's going to be most times below 10%. And that's very, interesting because within my field specifically, let's say if, a student needed a bilingual evaluation in order to learn more about, how their learning, how they learn best, it becomes really interesting. And sometimes, most districts are going to outsource, without the district, from outside the district. So what does that mean? It's going to create less of a connection with parents, less of a connection with families, to really, support students and, really advocate for them in schools. But I think the great thing about, being in my position is that I'm able to break all those barriers, right? I'm able to really engage with them, really create those conversations, and ultimately that dialogue that needed. It's not just it ends at a meeting, right? We meet and then we tell them what's going on and that's it, right? It's that active dialogue that we need to have. And just thinking about it, being a Latino male myself within my school, when students see me, like I love that they see themselves through me, because first of all, they see like, oh, like I wonder what Mr. Camacho is doing, in the school. Like how can and it's interesting because I've had students do this as well. Like they would come to my office just to say hi, hello, and just learn about more of what I did, and just because they just wanted to make that connection. And I truly enjoy that because sometimes when a student sees themselves through the people that are teaching them, through the people that are supporting them, that creates so many protective and positive factors in order to be successful in school. So that's why I always advocate, try to resemble your staff through your students, because it's going to go a long way.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I saw like on your Instagram stories that you even have like a PlayStation for your students and try to make it like, and that's awesome because then they want to go talk, like, right? They know you care, you know what they like, and they want to, sort of like hang out with you, but also like learn about what you're doing. And I do think that as a teacher, also like my students would ask me questions. So how did you become a teacher? Like, how do you even apply to college? And they have that confianza, like, you went through something similar. So so share how you did it, right? So do you to transition to like mental health in the Latino community is why do you think that mental health is so important for Latino communities? Because it's kind of a taboo like topic, right? Like, oh no, you only go al psicólogo si estás loca, like eso no se necesita, no gastes el dinero en eso,
or no necesito eso.
Sí, like do you get those comments still, like, or do you hear them, and like what do you like, what do you think about that, especially right now in the pandemic, right? That the needs increase.
Yeah, especially right now during a pandemic, right? When there's going to be so many, with everything that's going on, it makes you really think about, how, Nuestra Gente is doing, right? How are we doing every day? And a fact that has always been in my mind, and just, when it comes to like data and like statistics and all that, is that out of all Hispanic and Latinos who are having, difficulty and struggling with, mental health and even mental illness, is that 50% won't seek treatment. So what does that mean, right? Is that majority, of the time is that they're going to be going through something that they won't have the most appropriate support. And it's not something like, oh, if you don't think about it, it's going to go away, right? Sometimes it can worsen over time. But it also comes about also along with the stigma is, answering why, within our community, why isn't mental health prioritized? I also think about many of the systemic factors that come into play, right? So not only does it come to access, because, you need to access first, because if there's no access, there's no care, no access to anything, right? And then also, having stigma in mind, having, to really encourage, others to go ahead. There's also the barriers of language, right? Are there competent, practitioners out there that can not only speak our language, but also, culturally competent to understand our difficulties and our struggles. And it also comes to the quality of care. So sometimes, I unfortunately, there will be times when many individuals will seek treatment, but, feeling misunderstood, not really heard from their difficulties goes a long way. And then I think ultimately too, sometimes that's not talked about, is that acculturation also is very, important too. Sometimes, being, first generation, even myself being a first generation student, or even thinking about my parents, what they had to go through when they came to this country, having to assimilate, having to really adapt a second culture. It was a lot to them. But at the same time, there was a lot of barriers that were keeping them from being able to advocate for themselves, invest in their health overall, because at the end of the day, mental health is health, right? You can't separate it from your body. It's not one thing in your mind, and it's not going to affect everything else, right? It's all one thing. And when it comes to really being aware of the systemic factors really limiting us and, receiving care, I think that's very important. And then also being mindful that, sometimes, a family member can seek treatment because they have no insurance. They can't find somebody that can really understand them. They might be working 2 or additional jobs to, really make ends meet. And, there's ultimately no time for it. So there's many factors in it, but at the same time, that's why I'm in my field, especially with our students, to make them, aware that, what they're going through on a daily basis, is is, you know, it's real, it's reality that, you know, the world we're living in, it's not something like out of the ordinary. And just being able to be there for them, I think that's, you know, goes a long way in itself. And I'm hoping that, you know, as we progress, you know, being aware of the need and supports in schools, is that many people, you know, they get the hint that, like, you know, it's our struggles don't start when we hit adulthood, right? You know, our struggles come when we're going through school and we're facing all these things in life. So I'm hoping that people are aware of this, and that, you know, students are also going through it too. You know, they're not there. And I think the other thing too is that our students deserve to grow up, be curious about, like, the life they're living, in terms of, you know, how they're experiencing is natural and normal, because at the end of the day, emotions are trying to tell us something. Emotions carry information that our body is trying to tell ourselves. So if you catch yourself being, you know, upset, sad, you know, happy, you know, that's all part of, you know, the human experience. So I know it's getting a little philosophical, but just being mindful that, you know, mental health should be a priority. It should be, you know, a normal thing about a part of our lives, and it shouldn't be something like, hey, did you know that, you know, he's talking to you? You know, it shouldn't be like that, because, you know, it's our health at the end of the day.
I have a two-part question. So the first one would be, what would be your encouragement to other Latino psychologists in schools or in other settings where they find themselves to be the only bilingual psychologist, or the only one that looks like, like the students. Yeah, what would be your encouragement to them, especially right now? I know it was a tough year for everyone, and you guys had to kind of be there for others because that's your job, but you also needed others to be there for you, right? So what would be your encouragement to others like you?
I think, like, for example, if you're in a position where, you know, not many of your coworkers or colleagues, you know, look like you to begin with, or even share the same experiences, is that have the opportunity to create those, you know, those connections, or even find like a support group that, you know, are going through the similar experiences as you. So one of the things is that I was really surprised is that, you know, in being in graduate school, I was like, man, I can't be the only one who's experiencing, you know, feeling like it's tough, it's hard, you know, not being able to have people there for you. And I started just being, you know, being like asking questions, like, you know, there has to be people out there. And thankfully, you know, I found those, you know, those people. I connected with them. And sometimes you'll be surprised that, you know, sometimes, you know, our experiences are similar, even though they might be different. So thankfully, you know, within my, you know, cohort, I had, you know, similar people going through difficulty. You know, for example, one of the biggest things for me at the time of being a graduate student was, you know, how am I going to fund this, right? So there's people out there that are having the same difficulty. There's some out there that felt like disconnected from their work because, you know, they were working from home. So any way you find those connections, they're very valuable, because it's going to remind you every day that, like, hey, I'm not the only one going through this. You know, there's people out there that I can connect with, and just having a moment to share out with somebody, it's going to go a long way. And I think, you know, especially when you're in a field that's, you know, like mental health, and you know, and just a field that's very tough. Maybe not the body, like you're working long hours out in the sun, but like it takes a toll on you, mentally and emotionally. So just being able to, you know, find, you know, what works for you, what's beneficial to you. If it means, you know, just having downtime to yourself, or just being, you know, on the phone with somebody, or any way that, you know, works for you, just able to find those connections. And because I know it's going to go a long way, and you're definitely not alone in your experience, because we're still in a pandemic, you know, literally. And I think we need to refine those connections that help us remind us, you know, what we're going through.
And then finally, what would be your consejos for aspiring Latino psychologists, specifically school psychologists?
You know, especially with, you know, my field, you know, if you're interested in pursuing, learning more about mental health education, you know, this is an amazing opportunity for you to explore. Most of our programs, you know, specialization programs, are 3 years. And then also, you know, I would just say, you know, whether it's just like any other field, you know, and being Latino, odds are you're going to find yourself that, you know, there's not going to be many people that look like you, are like you. But I can tell you this, when you find your passion and you know what you love to do, that's going to be the guiding, strength behind everything you do. Whether it's, finding funding for any program you want to seek, whether that's, making the networking, connections within fields you want to go into. Once you find that passion, it's going to go a long way. And I know that especially in our field, being in mental health, especially, servicing, nuestra gente, it's going to go a long way because you're going to find yourself, making connections between, oh my goodness, like this parent I just met is just like my mom, or this community I'm working in is just like the one I grew up in. So whether, it's school psychology or any field you're in, I really hope you find your match because you're already going to make an impact by who you are and what you're going to do in your field. So, keep going. And if you need any, help within school psychology specifically, free reach out to me. I'll be happy to connect with you for.
Thank you. I have one more question if you won't feel comfortable answering it. But so right now we're in a pandemic and I know you can't give us like a therapy session right now or anything, but what are some other consejos for people who are struggling with mental health? Like you just suggested right now, like making sure you have time for yourself, like what are other tips that you give to people right now? Like that, a lot of people are still at home a lot and they're stressed. Like, are there any tips that you recommend to like kind of calm yourself and just refocus the energy?
Of course. I think right now, since if you're still at home and you find yourself, being, by yourself and, asking yourself questions, it's a perfect time to really evaluate what you have in your life that's creating joy, that's bringing, liveliness into your world, and also many other things that may not be as helpful. So we always talk about, coping strategies and stuff like that. And sometimes they're not the most helpful, right? So I know for myself, there's times where I was just eating anything I could, that was in the house, right? Something as basic as that, watching, what, how your body is treated. And then aside from that, just acknowledging, what's going to help you, move forward and support you. So if you find yourself, not having as much support, whether that's calling a family member you trust, whether that's a close friend you have, in your world, like that's going to be, someone that you might call today and just say, hey, how you doing? And it brings about, that human connection that's so needed right now that we don't have because of, of course, with technology, social media, that we forget those basic needs that we need in our life. But of course, if you find yourself, having difficulty that you might need more support, just try to connect with someone who you trust, in your life, and then hopefully you will get the support you need. But I think one thing that it's really helped me is, I don't know how many people, have a pet or a dog or anything like that, but, I have a dog named Canelo, and like the first thing he does every morning is basically like bark at me to take him on a walk. And I think that's so funny because that gets me up, up and going, because I could so easily find myself, sleeping in or just having, spending the whole day in bed. But, finding what works for you, it's going to go a long way, and just, sticking to it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you so much for being here with us. I feel like we learned so much from you, and we're excited for others to hear your story and like all your accomplishments. And once again, congrats on becoming Dr. Camacho.
Yeah. Yes, and thank you also everyone else for listening. If you're on Spotify or watching, if you're on YouTube, remember to give us a follow. We are also on Instagram and Facebook as Watch and Make Podcast. We will see you next time for our next episode.
Nos vemos. Adiós.